Hello. So in this video, we're going to go through the process that I made this teaser for the Tolkien episode that's coming out. Actually, if you're watching this live, it's coming out tomorrow on Friday, October 4th. So real quick, before we begin, I'll play this video in case you haven't seen it. And I've put it out on social, and I've published some ads for it and such. So you may have seen this already put it on the YouTube channel as well. But here is this video, and I'll just let this play through real quick.
Can you give an overview of some of Tolkien's experiences during World War I that might have influenced some of the characters or places in his stories later on?
The first and most obvious and immediate effect is that straight after the Battle of the Somme, Tolkien sat down and wrote a story called The Fall of Gondolin. Gondolin is a fabulous, beautiful city of the elves, and it's destroyed by a ravenously materialistic tyrant. And leading the assault are things that Tolkien describes as monsters or beasts or dragons. And yet he describes them very unlike the way he describes, say, Smaug, the dragon in The Hobbit. These dragons, they are metallic. They roll over things, over obstacles. Some of them open up and troops climb out.
Okay, so as you can see, a very short and sweet and to the point. And so the concept there is essentially that I wanted to pick out a piece of audio from the full interview, and that was about a minute long. And so get that to just kind of whet the appetite and hopefully entice you, give you a reason to listen. So, and then, of course, I needed some sort of a visual if I was going to do it into a video, because a lot of places, YouTube is a great example of that. YouTube, Facebook, and Instagram, and Twitter, and all these places don't really like just straight up audio. And so advertising for a podcast or putting that out there for a podcast, a lot of times you actually need a video component as well. So I thought it would be fun to throw together a little teaser like this. And this is the process that I went through. The first step, and I've gone through my audio editing process a lot before, and the very first step was to find a clip from the overall audio interview. And I even did a live stream editing some of the interview for this episode. And so I went through the process of finding a clip for that interview or for this that I would pull out and get that minute worth of audio in order to do that. Once I had that, the next step that I took was to come in and take a picture. So this is a photograph that I took of John Garth's book. So obviously I purchased the book and read through it before doing the interview. And then since I had it, I went ahead and took a picture of it. And this was kind of the backdrop for the video. The next step on that, essentially, the first thing I needed to do before creating the actual video itself was to create this kind of a background and create the assets, the elements for it. So there's a few different steps here. So this is the Filmstrip itself. So if I open this up, this is a smart object. You can see this is the actual Filmstrip. And because I have it going up and down, I had to rotate the text. So you can see this is putting together the entire strip. And I actually had this broken into, this is actually repeating a little bit. So you can see I didn't use, this was if I needed more. I wasn't exactly sure. I wrote out the blocks of text that I wanted. And then once I needed to actually start fitting it into the cells or the frames itself, it was a little difficult sometimes. So I had to tweak that. And you see this one here. This one was a little unique, and you can see how you saw in the video how I actually changed that, or it animated the camera in, and we'll look at that here in a little bit. But so this is the film strip. I did a little bit of cleanup on it, so you can see on the edges here in order to get them to go together. So once they're lined up, I just kind of did a little bit of cleanup in order to merge those together to make it look like it was all one strip there. So with this strip, there's actually two versions of this. So I have the film strip, and then I have the film strip available. So the difference here essentially is this part right here. So on the other, if I open that one up again, I closed it. So you can see coming October 4th, which again, if you're listening to this live, this is that is tomorrow. And then subscribe today, because of course, if you subscribe to a podcast, then as soon as it comes out tomorrow, if you're already subscribed to the podcast, you'll get a notification when that episode drops. So that's one version, and then I have another version. So once the actual episode is released, then I can do another marketing push with a video that it's already out. It's available. You can listen to it right away. And so that's this film strip right here. So I didn't want to have to recreate the entire video once the episode was released, but I also wanted a version that had the dates. So you'll see there's actually two versions. The one that we watched at the very beginning of this was the coming soon. It had the date at the end, and we'll see some of the differences here as we go through. One of those being, of course, the film strip I just mentioned. The next was I wanted to add some paper to it, just kind of throw some. I was trying to think of different things that could be, an author. We're talking about Tolkien, and he's real familiar, obviously, with writings. Of course, a lot of people are familiar with the movies, but the movies, of course, are based on his books. And then, of course, John Garth being an author as well, I thought it kind of tied in together to have writing and notes and scribbles. And so I have a bunch of these different pieces of paper just kind of thrown in there, with the idea being it just kind of throws in a little bit of aesthetic to it. So that wasn't actually part of the original photograph. I had to comp that in. So there's a few different things that I did there in order to do that. Obviously, you can see this is going over the book. Now, in order to make it look like it is is actually behind the book, what I did was essentially masking out the book itself. So you can see this mask here. So I just created that mask around the book, and then set that on top, and then created another one for just the shadow. So just the shadow there. And that gives the illusion that that paper is actually kind of slid underneath the book, and you can see that there. And if you're not familiar with Photoshop, I should probably have mentioned this. If you're not familiar with Photoshop, I actually have a Photoshop course that explains all the basics of Photoshop. You can find that on Udemy, or of course you can hit me up and let me know that you'd like that, and I can send you a link to that. So I'm not really explaining the basics of Photoshop in this video. That's not really the purpose of this. But if you want to know more about how to create stuff like this and how to work in Photoshop or After Effects, we'll get into After Effects in a little bit. Just let me know. I don't have an After Effects course yet, but maybe I should create one. All right, so this is the actual mat itself. If I turn this, so basically this is what I did. I just created a shape around that, and then use that. You can turn that into a selection and create a mask out of that. That's how I did that. And then I like to keep that layer just in case I need it for something else. The lower third here, you can see this. So this is something that is only in the now available version. So once the episode is actually live, because this is not in the coming soon, not the version that has the date on it, but the one that mentioned it's already live. So the idea being, of course, you can listen to it right away. And that was another reason for having the papers here, was because I knew I wanted this lower third down there, and I didn't want that to cover up this film strip. And so I needed a little bit of buffer room from the bottom of the frame until that film strip comes in. And then, of course, I add a little bit of effect to it. So we have this sun, which is essentially a shadow. So if you see this, let me turn off all these layers here. You can see this here. It might be a little bit difficult. Let me just create a new layer here so you can see. So this is the shadow. So this is just actually this is part of a graphic stock package that I purchased many years ago and found helpful. So this is a simple shadow here, and then I have some levels effect on it. And what that's going to allow me to do is with this, I actually animate this, and we'll see this in After Effects once we get there. But essentially, I'm going through the process of moving this so you can see, and it's going to be really slight. I don't even know if you really noticed it initially, but the idea being that, you know, I took this picture of the book, and so I wanted it to this is, you know, my kitchen table, and so I took a picture of this book on the kitchen table, and I want it to be like there's light coming in, and you kind of have time passing, and as this is going on, and of course, you know, kind of a stop motion effect, and that takes time, and so time is passing, and so you have this sun effect that kind of gives that illusion, as well as this kind of moves as the shadow moves. So again, it's going to be very, very slight, but I needed that asset in there in order to animate that. And then on top, I have this kind of a film effect, just a bunch of effects here in order to help tie everything together. So this is a common technique in VFX or in compositing. Once you have all your elements kind of put together, when you throw an effect on top, and a lot of times that comes down to colorization, that comes down to like grains, you add some film grains. A lot of times in VFX especially, they'll cover up things with motion blur, movement of things and things like that. So what essentially you're doing is you're tying everything together. So you have all of these different elements. So this is made up of a bunch of different elements, and then you're going in there and saying there's this one element that kind of ties it all together. And so because there's this consistent look over the entire thing, it almost tricks your eye, and it tricks your brain into thinking, okay, this must all belong together, even though it's a bunch of different things thrown together. And so that's essentially what this is doing right here, as well as the sun effect too, which we'll get to once we kind of see how it's animated. But I already kind of showed what it's going to do in that. So that is this group here, and these are all flattened. So I actually created it in here so you can see all the different layers for these different things. So, you know, for example, you know, this is just that one layer, and then just the text. So I actually created it all with layers, but then once we actually bring it into After Effects, there's some things we need to flatten. So like the lower third is a great example there. I flatten that into a smart object, which will bring it into After Effects as a composition. And we'll see that once we actually pull open After Effects here in a second. But the last thing I wanted to chat about, and again, if we come back to layers, you can see all these different screens here. So those are these screens here, and I've created a few different screens. So at the very beginning, you could see this screen here. This is a screen that I did that's obviously kind of based off the Motion Picture Association of America and their kind of screen that they have before each. And so these are the layers in order to create that. If I turn off my photograph here, essentially just, you know, a background fill and then just a bunch of text. And then I create the little block, and you have the drop shadow on it, and that was fun to just kind of throw in there and mention, okay, yeah, it's safe for work. And, you know, you assume it's rating purposes, and essentially for podcasts, there's 2 ratings, at least on Apple Podcasts, the big dog in the space. There's clean or explicit, and this is, of course, clean. There's no swearing, but we do mention The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit, so I thought that would be kind of fun to throw in. Little bits there. And then we have available, so in some versions of the video, we're going to have this part here because I wanted to throw in that with podcasts, of course, you can subscribe, but these days you can subscribe to everything like Netflix and Hulu and you know, even YouTube, right? And you can subscribe, and a lot of those subscriptions cost money. And so with podcasts, of course, they are absolutely free. And so kind of throwing that in there that you can subscribe for free And then a different version of that, essentially. So, get notified on release, so that, again, that's coming beforehand, or listen immediately, that's already been released. So with those created, and then I needed to create a couple extra screens here. So essentially what I did was flatten the entire image. So this whole image here, I just flattened it down into a single layer. And then through the logo on there, and through this text on here. And again, this was kind of designed to look a lot like the coming soon screens that you see on a lot of movies. And of course, it's a very common thing. Of course, usually you have multiple actors and such that you have listed there under the title. But throwing this together, so this is one of the screens, and then we have, of course, the now available screen, and then the release date screen. So this, of course, is going to go on the version of the video that we watched at the beginning of this stream, which goes to before the actual episode is released. And then once the actual episode is released, which again will be tomorrow if you're watching this live, then it will be switched to this one right here. Once I had all those layers created, again, to bring them into After Effects, I wanted to flatten them down. You can deal with layers in After Effects, but if you can flatten a lot of that, then there's two benefits to doing that once you actually start animating this in a video program. One benefit is, of course, organization purposes. There's less layers for you to have to deal with. And if you know that you're not going to be making changes to that, once I had this is a font screen that's going to stay static, I'm not animating anything on it, then you know that you can just flatten it down and just let it sit. The other big benefit of that, of course, is once it's flattened, then the computer doesn't have to calculate it anymore. And so the more layers that you have when you start animating something in After Effects, or even in Premiere, or whatever sort of video program you're using, the more layers that you have, the more assets it has to deal with, the more it has to calculate, and the longer it takes, and the more processing power it takes. The longer it takes to render at the end, and the more processing power it takes as you're working on it as well. And so you can mitigate a lot of that stuff for the elements that you're not going to animate. And for something like this, don't want to animate it. I just want it on the screen. It's a still font screen, and just so it'll sit there for a while and be really easy to read. So that's what these are here, the things that we just looked at as far as the layers are concerned. And of course, if you really need to come in and change that, you can change that and then replace the footage in After Effects. That's an easy process as well. All right, so with this, let's minimize Photoshop and let's open up After Effects and see what it looks like in here. So again, there are two versions, and basically I created one of the versions first. This is the coming soon version. And then the now available version. So what I'll do is I'll walk through the coming soon version, because that is the version of this that I created first. And then from there, I'll show a couple of the changes that we made in now available. It was very minimal. Of course, we already looked at basically the changes. We looked in Photoshop, the different font screen at the end, the different introduction here as well. So here is the basic process. So this, of course, is the layer that we looked at in Photoshop, right? So once I imported that, and when you import, let me look here. So let me pull this over real quick so I can show this just in case. And again, I'm not really showing the key parts here, or how the program itself works, but as far as this is concerned, you'll want to import, so Control I in order to import, and then if you import this file here, you can import it either as footage or composition. So if you import it as footage, then it'll ask you either what layer you want, because it recognizes it's a Photoshop document with layers, or you can compress all that down and create it just like it's one still image. Or you can do a composition, or composition retain layer sizes. So if your layers go outside the bounds of the document in Photoshop, then it'll retain that. You can see kind of what that looks like here. So this is what I usually will do. Of course, that's going to take up more processing power than if it constrains it to the size of the document. So once you import that, then it's going to import all of these different layers. So all these different layers here, if we look in this project, all these different layers are the same layers that we have over here. So all these different layers are pulled into After Effects. However, you can see what it did was it created compositions. And so these are compositions. So it created a composition for that. So here is the now available screen. It is not a group like it is here in Photoshop. It is now a composition. And so it doesn't really retain the same organization in Photoshop when you pull it into After Effects. And so that's something to keep in mind. You can see essentially this is now alphabetical listed here by the layer name. And so you get a bunch of these, color fills and ellipses and levels and, all these different things that make up the effects that we wanted. But it really is a pain to deal with organizationally. And so that's why I mentioned if you can kind of single out those layers that you actually want to animate and you actually want to work with and start to flatten those down and start to organize those a little bit better, then the rest of these you can just kind of leave and have them be, and just know that, that's creating that overall effect that you were going for. All right, so let's move on and walk through this coming soon. So here is the initial. So I have the opacity set to 100, and then of course a keyframe here, 1 second duration in order to go down to 0, so it disappears. And after that, you could clip that if you wanted to. I didn't. You could do Alt open bracket in order to clip that. But basically at that point it disappears. And then it shows everything underneath. So let me dial these up. Give us a little bit more room here to see the timeline. All right. So here is how this is organized here. So some of these are turned off, like available now. So in the available now, you can see I should have that right here. So it calls it release date, but it's actually the available now. You can see the source name. I just had the layer name the same. So this is actually pulling that in right there. But in this one, of course, I have it turned off because we're not dealing with that quite yet. So you can see kind of how this is starting to come together. The key part of this, though, and the most time-consuming part of this, of course, was the animation of the film strip itself. And so the way I animated that, and you can see the actual scene is animated as well. So there's 2 steps to this, and I'll start by explaining, let's actually start by explaining the scene animation first, and then I'll explain the animation on the film strip itself. So the way I animated this was with this camera. So you can see right now we're actually looking through a camera. So I created a camera in After Effects. When you create a camera and then you have things in 3D, so these are all in 3D, all these layers are in 3D, then you can start to actually animate the position and the rotation of that camera. And it's tough to see right now because we're actually looking through that camera. So this is the camera I'm looking through in order to render this out. Think of it just like if you have, have a camera and you're looking through that camera, that's exactly what you're doing when you're doing that here in After Effects. So if I switch this to a 2 view, you can see this is my virtual camera right here. And so I'm looking through this, and this is the background right here. So you can see that is what it's looking at right there. So if I select this camera and move it, watch what happens here. If I move it in the Y, you can see how it moves it up and down. So that's what I'm looking at. I'm going to undo that. But if I so rather than the left view, let's switch to the top view. So now we're looking down on the scene. And so now if I select this here, you can see now instead of Y, now it's easier to access the X axis. And so you can see how you animate this here. And then of course, Z is going to be in and out, right? So essentially that's what I'm doing. If I pull this all the way out, you can see this is our scene here, and this is what it would look like. Of course, you never want to get to that point to where you can actually see that. And again, this is a very common thing in compositing or VFX, or in that space. It's all about kind of the illusion of it, right? So with that said, you can kind of see how this scene is set up here. I also have a light. So this light right here, again, if I move this, you can start to see how it affects the scene. So with this light, I actually have it animated. So this is where it starts. If I zoom out, you can see. So this is where it starts, and then once I move over here, you can see it moves to over here. So as the camera is moving, and if we watch over here, as the camera is moving, you can see how all of this animation kind of plays in, right? So you have the camera that moves slightly. You have the light that moves, right? And then of course we zoom in order to be able to see this bit right here. I work at quarter view, and so working at a quarter resolution, it makes it blurry like that, but it also makes it run a lot faster on the computer. So I'm going to switch this back. Typically, that's how you're going to want to work in After Effects for a lot of stuff, is quarter, and then as you're working, and then switch to full view when you actually need to see it. But for the most part, I already know what this looks like, and so I don't need to look at it in full res every single time or all the time while I'm working. I just need to focus on the animation part of it. So that's how that camera is animated. You can see the keyframes here. So I'm animating the position, the rotation in the Z axis. So if I rotate this, you can see what that looks like. It's a little tough to see right there. Let's switch over here and switch to our left view. So left view, so it'll be easier to see. And so if I rotate this, you can see what it's doing. So we're kind of zooming in and zooming out and doing that sort of effect. Right? That's kind of the effect we're doing. And then of course the point of interest, which is this little guy right here. So you can see kind of where that, so not only the position of it, but also the point of interest. You can see that right here. And so that's another little helpful way to say, okay, not only here is the camera, but this is the point that it's supposed to be focusing on. And that's kind of helpful there to animate that as well, to make sure that it's looking at the right thing. So probably a good example of that. I'll pull over my little prop here again, right? So here's a camera. So as you're moving it, so this is the position as you're moving it. But if you say that this is the point of interest, then it'll go like this, because it knows it's supposed to be focusing on this. And so if that doesn't move, it kind of automatically will rotate a little bit there, or orbit around that a little bit. So that's kind of how that works. So yeah, so the light, I added that light in conjunction with the sun. So remember the shadow that I did in Photoshop? This is a very simple animation here. And the sun, actually, it looks like I removed that. I forgot about that. I removed that. So here I'm learning something myself. So I tried that, and it ended up being too much. So there is no movement on the sun, on the shadow. That's right. I think I did remove that. But it's still in there. It just doesn't move. So you can see kind of how that would look if it were. But it's not. So that's the end of that. Sometimes when you're working on something, you have an idea and then you decide, you know what, that's too much. Sometimes less is more. And then, of course, the film effect, kind of the look over top. So some of these, of course, just kind of sit there and go for the overall look. Okay, so that is a look at how the camera is animated and how all of that is done here in this. And it's very, very similar over here. It's the same concept. Again, I did one first and then I duplicated it so you can see the render camera over here as well. And you can see how, you know, it moves, and the same concept, it zooms in, right? So once I had all of that done on a single video, then I could just duplicate it and then swap out those elements that I need for now available. With that, now let's move on to another explanation here of the film strip here. So the film strip is right here. And again, that's the layer that I pulled in from Photoshop, you recall. And hold on. All this talking makes you thirsty. So the way the film strip works, if I pull open the keyframes here, let's zoom in a little bit. So I wanted a stop motion effect. I wanted this to look like it was kind of stop motion-y, and there were a lot of different iterations that this went through. If I pull over the files here, you can see I went through multiple iterations here, multiple versions, trying to figure out a good way to get this film strip stop motion type effect. And of course, you know, all of that harkens back to a mixture of John Garth, of course, being an author and a historian, and he wrote this great book. But, you know, also at the end of the day, we are talking about the historical accuracy of the movie. And so those two things kind of play off each other. So that's kind of the concept there. So I wanted to animate it in a stop motion type of way, and that way I could jump between the different frames on the film strip. So what I did here, if we zoom in really close, is you go from one frame, so this is at 9 seconds, and then 9 seconds and 1 frame. So there's no frames in between this, and that's how you essentially how you get kind of a stop motion effect. Is if you think about it, when you're doing it, when you're taking pictures, you take a picture of say this is your subject, and you take a picture of it, and then you move the subject and you take another picture, and so there's no frames in between there, and it gives you that jerky stop motion effect. And so in order to mimic that in a virtual world, you're going to have no frames in between. If I were to move this and have some frames in between, then you'll see how it will start to try to do that. Actually, switch the... And this one here, I'm just doing this real quick. I'll have to undo this. So you can see how it moves up. So what I did there, I'll explain that. after animating this at a single frame, I also changed. You can see these are no longer little diamonds, and they're little diamonds when they're keyframes in After Effects. So what I did here was I changed the interpolation into a hold, and so that holds it so it doesn't try to slide or it doesn't move, and there's no little movement there on that. And so you can see how these keyframes are changed. The interpolation is changed, right, into a hold, and so that holds that keyframe there. So that's one of them. Oops, let me pull that back real quick. And actually, so this is I love this little shy guy right here. You can see the shy switch. So all these. So if I turn that on, then it pretty much just hides all of it. So what I'm able to do, you can see all of these layers once I had those. And then as I'm animating, I just focus in on just those layers that I need. And again, it comes down to organization and just focusing on the layers that you need to focus on as you are going through the animating process. Oops, don't want to add a keyframe there. So that's one jump number one, and then I leave it on for a few seconds because you're going to need time to read it. And typically in the editing world, at least what I was taught by my mentor in the editing space, was typically 4 to 5 seconds is the minimum of what you need for somebody to be able to read something. That is completely subjective because there's a lot of factors that go into that. One of those key factors being the amount of text. So obviously if there's more text, it needs to be on there longer for people to read it. Of course, if there's more text, people probably aren't going to read it. Some people don't appreciate a lot of text. So the this here be the next one, which is at 17 seconds. So we are at about 8 seconds between that and that. So it's a nice slow zoom. There's a little bit of movement there, so you can see the camera's kind of zooming in, and again you can see the animation over here. It'd probably be easier if I switch back to top. You can see that the animation of the camera just slightly over here. And then there is that slight jump. So again, this keyframe here, if we zoom in on the timeline, you can see the keyframe is going to start at 17 seconds, and then at 1 frame it's going to jump. So it jumps, but you'll notice that the bottom frame here is now at the top. So I wanted a little bit of consistency there and overlap so that you can see we're continuing on, right? So it's not just like a brand new object here, but we're actually continuing on with the frame. And let me turn this off here because my alarm's about to go off on my phone. So, all right. So when that jumps, again, we're going to need some more time in order to allow people to catch up and read and see what that new part of the strip says. So again, we're going to need some seconds here. And the next jump is at 24. Right, so again, we're at about 7 seconds there. We're giving a few seconds in order to read this, and really these are the only two that you should need to read. This one here you've already read from the previous one, and of course you'll glance at it again to know that, you know, oh, I already knew that was already part of it. So you have a few seconds, and again the camera is going to continue its slow move. You can see it's kind of tough to see when you zoomed out, but if you look closer you can see the slow movement that it has. And you can see the effect that it's doing over here until the next jump. So the next jump here, I didn't, you notice it switches. You don't see John Garth's name here like you do on the bottom. And so originally I did have it that way. But in order to switch to this, there were actually... It was a mixture of the time needed versus the amount of frames. The actual, so this being a frame, this being a frame, this being a frame, not necessarily the frames on the timeline here. So a mixture of I guess the frames on the timeline there versus the frames up there. So I needed to be able to get all of those in. And so in order to do that, I kind of cheated a little bit on this. And so I jumped to right here. On the next one, I jumped to, so this is actually John's name up here. If I were to switch to left, let me find my camera here. So if I were to move this up, you'll see John's name up here. So basically all I did was, that's the frame, and then I allowed these frames here. So the key one here being, of course, the date. That's going to be the key. And then we'll reiterate that at the end. You'll typically, for things, as you're, of course, the audio is going on in the background. So, that's really what most people are going to be focusing on. And so you want to reiterate a few different times the key date, which in this case is going to be the release date of the episode. And then we have that on for a few seconds. You can see the camera movements. You can see, if I switch top view again is probably easiest, and zoom out a little bit, you can see the light. So this is the light. You can see how that is moving as well. All of this is coming together until the next one. So again, we have 7 seconds or so of time. And then jump to this here. Actually, I guess that was 24, not 23. I read that wrong. So it would be 8 seconds or so. So this jump here, again, it's going to be the frame right below this. So again, if I take this and just for the sake here, if we move this up, you'll see this part up here. So we're slowly moving the film strip up, essentially, is what we're doing. And After Effects autosave, yay. Autosave is actually a good thing, except when you're trying to move along. There we go. So it jumps there. And then, of course, we have this issue where it's really, really hard to read that. And that was something I was trying to figure out how to fit that on there. Of course, the podcast website is based on a truestorypodcast.com, and that is very difficult to fit. It's a long URL. I recognize it's a long URL, and it's hard to fit onto a small film strip like this. So I also own the domain name Boats Podcast. Boats, B-O-A-T-S, of course, being the acronym for Based on a True Story. So with that, and really that, if you go to that URL, it just forwards to basedonatruestorypodcast.com. The only reason I purchased that was because it's shorter. And so I'm able to do things like this, where boatspodcast.com/subscribe is actually, and in the htaccess file for that, I have it as a redirect to the subscribe page on basedonatruestorypodcast.com. And so essentially all that does is that takes you to subscribe, which of course, so if I pull this up, let me, this is going to be, you'll see what happens here. If you go to boatspodcast.com/subscribe, you can see it's just going to forward you to basedonatruestorypodcast.com/subscribe. And then, of course, you have all these different, whatever your favorite platform is, where you want to subscribe at. So that's what that link, that's the date that you need. The next step is going to be, where do I go to subscribe? And so that is the URL. So with that, we need to actually focus on that a little bit more. And so this is the most amount of animation that we do here on the camera. And after a few seconds, so again, you don't want it to jump in too fast, because then it's disorienting. You want to have a few seconds here of, okay, that's what this thing is. You can see subscribe today to get notified. And then you you can see we're going to zoom in. So here, you can see the animation on the camera here. We are taking this. We're also twisting, so it's zooming in and twisting to that. And again, we're at quarter, so if I switch it to full, you can see what that's going to look like. And I have motion blur turned off, but you can turn on motion blur and get some really nice, it'll blur that as it actually zooms in. While you're working, I would recommend turning off motion blur because it slows down your computer even more, especially while you're streaming. So just make sure to turn it back on once you render for the final look. And so it sits here and then here, so another frame change back to John Garth's name, and because that's kind of again the key, being the date, the name. Again, reiterating that's what we're doing. That's what we're focusing on. Oops. I'm getting a notification that my stream is stuttering here. Everything looks okay. Interesting. Well, if you're noticing issues, I apologize. I don't see anything wrong here. It doesn't show any dropped frames or anything. But we'll continue on. So with this, once we move on to this part here, the next step is going to be the final frames. So there's a few seconds here of just animation and just kind of that movement, and then it transitions into again that flattened frame, the final flattened frame that we had in the Photoshop document, and these guys here. So this is the presents font screen that we created in Photoshop, and then this is the release date. And again, you want those on for more time. So this one here starts at 55 seconds, and then it ends at almost a minute and 2 seconds. You got 30 frames per second, so almost a minute and 2 seconds. So again, about 7 seconds of time there for this. And hopefully, I know there's a lot of text on here, but hopefully the idea here is you've already seen in the film strip, you've already seen that we're talking about Tolkien, it's John Garth, and it's based on a true story. And so hopefully you've got a lot of this is reiteration of the things that we've been talking about throughout this entire animation here. And then, of course, at the very end, the final thing here is when it's released. And again, that's something very common in trailers and teasers that you'll see from movies, of course, is the release date, and then the website to get it once it's actually released. And that is pretty much the end. So this is the final audio here, and then of course it ends right here, and then it just kind of stops. And that's the final frame that it ends on. Now, again, that's the coming soon version. In the now available version, of course, it is pretty much the same, except at the end it says now available. And I just noticed that the PSD says available now instead of now available. Oh well. Little things like that. But of course the information up before it is the same. It's just a matter of, now it's available instead of the release date before. And then of course the strip itself, we are using the available film strip that we saw earlier when we were looking at the Photoshop document that says now available instead of available October 4th. So those are some of the little changes there. Now available, subscribe today. You can listen today, as you subscribe today and listen today at the same time, as opposed to subscribe today to get notified when it's released. So slight little changes there in the messaging. Overall concept is pretty much the same though. And there we go. There we have it. So at the very beginning of this, I showed the coming soon version. Let me pull open the now available version and we can see the difference.
Can you give an overview of some of Tolkien's experiences during World War I that might have influenced some of the characters or places in his stories later on?
The first and most obvious and immediate effect is that straight after the Battle of the Somme, Tolkien sat down and wrote a story called The Fall of Gondolin. Gondolin is a fabulous, beautiful city of the elves, and it's destroyed by a ravenously materialistic tyrant. And leading the assault are things that Tolkien describes as monsters or beasts or dragons. And yet he describes them very unlike the way he describes, say, Smaug, the dragon in The Hobbit. These dragons, they are metallic. They roll over things, over obstacles. Some of them open up and troops climb out.
And there you go. So you can see the now available at the end there. And that is the final render. And that kind of brings us to an end of this little explainer video showing how the teaser was made. Now you'll also notice if you've been following the Based on a True Story YouTube channel, I threw that up there. So you already saw that up there, of course. And then earlier I had one for Tag, the episode for Tag, and that was the very first teaser that I wanted to try to do in order to help promote the episode a little bit beforehand. So that was the first time I did it. Very similar technique to this one here. The next episode that will be coming out in the future, I'm currently working on creating one for that. And I'm changing up a few things in that one. I don't know if I'll do the stop motion effect like this one here. Just changing up a few different things here. But of course, we will see that in the future once that is ready to go. So hopefully you enjoyed this little explainer video going through the process in Photoshop. So we went through all of the different layers and we kind of explained how all of this is put together here inside of Photoshop. We also explained how once we had it in Photoshop and then we took it over into After Effects and explained how it was all set up inside of After Effects and all of the animation and the camera animation and the 3D animation on the camera and all that fun stuff and the light sources and all that stuff, and explaining all of that. So hopefully you enjoyed this. Hopefully you learned something new, and you kind of learned how Photoshop and After Effects can work together in order to create some really cool effects. So if you enjoyed this, by all means, let me know, and perhaps in the future I can show some more behind the scenes of things that are beyond just the audio side. Of course, as an audio podcast, the audio side is very, very important. But there's a lot of other stuff too, like this here, that goes into it as well. And so if you'd like to see more of that, by all means, let me know. In the meantime, I hope you enjoy the rest of your day, because if you are watching this on October 3rd, then tomorrow you will get to enjoy the episode with John Garth talking about the true story behind the movie Tolkien. And that was it was a great interview. I was super happy with that. I think because John was just a pleasure to talk to, and I learned a ton as we were going through this, and it was a blast to talk to him. And I'm a huge Tolkien fan. I love Lord of the Rings. I love The Hobbit, and so it was just a blast to get to talk to him and learn from him. And of course, if you haven't yet, go pick up his book. It's a great book. I can't recommend it enough. But there's a little special bit at the end of the episode. He talks about his next book coming out, and he explains what that is about. And as much as I enjoyed this book, I am super looking forward to his next book because it sounds like it will be amazing. So make sure to listen to the end of that episode in order to know that. And that is coming out tomorrow, as of this recording, October 4th. So of course, if you're listening to this anytime after today, then it is already out. So go check it out at basedonatruestorypodcast.com. You can find it out there. Or just search for Based on a True Story in your favorite podcast app of choice. You can find it in there. Or, as we learned in here, if you go to boatspodcast.com/subscribe, then you can subscribe there. Or, of course, if you're already on YouTube, you can just hit the subscribe, as every YouTuber says, right? Just hit the subscribe button, and you'll get a notification because it'll pop up on YouTube as well. I'm starting to put stuff more on there as well. Thanks again so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this, and bye for now. I'll chat with you again at a later point.